May the Lord be with you. This is Pastor Ryan Stout over here at St. Peter's Lutheran Church, and this video is part of our CliffsNotes Confirmation series, the aim of which, in this time of COVID-19 and quarantine, is to keep us all on the same page when it comes to confirmation instruction with our youth and their families. I realize there are many reasons why people might not be able or might not feel safe to come and join us for our regular class discussion on the first and third Sundays of each month. So this way, at least, while a half an hour video may not make up for an hour class, we can stay pretty much up to date. We can stay pretty much, again, on the same page. Now, today we are covering lessons 23 and 24 out of, I believe, 31. So we're coming up toward the end of our time together talking about the First Testament, the Old Testament, both the Hebrew Bible and the Greek books of the Old Testament, which we like to call the Apocrypha. And you may recall from last time, we talked about Elijah and Elisha. Elijah was the great wonder-working prophet, especially in the northern kingdom of Israel, and Elisha was his successor and protege, the Robin to his Batman. And we also talked a little bit about the exile. And one of the things I try to stress with regards to the exile is a shorthand, what I call the ABCs, right? So around 1000 BC, we had the United Kingdom of Israel under Saul and David and Solomon. And then after Solomon, due to his abuses and the abuses of his son, the kingdom sundered. It split into north and south, with the south being called Judah and the north being called Ephraim, or sometimes just Israel, though that can be confusing when the northern kingdom has the same name Israel as the United Kingdom did. Regardless, today we are going to talk about important prophets of the exile and then the return from exile. Those ABCs I talked about, the A is the Assyrians, who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, Ephraim, carried its people off to become the lost tribes of Israel, around the year 722 BC, I believe it was. B was for the Babylonians, the next big empire, who conquered the Assyrians and then managed to conquer the southern kingdom of Judah around 586 BC, something the Assyrians were never able to do due to divine protection, according to the Bible, and also according to some interesting Egyptian records from around the same time. But whereas the northern kingdom, their people were taken off to become the lost tribes. There are descendants of the lost tribes, but as political units, those tribes are done. But the southern kingdom of Judah, when those people were taken off into exile, they managed to maintain a Jewish identity. They had lost everything that they associated with God. They lost the promised land, they lost the temple, they lost the Davidic kingship, everything that they knew of religion, of faith, of spirituality, everything they knew of Yahweh, the great I am, had been lost in the exile. And so the question became, who are we now? I mean, can we still be of the kingdom of Judah without the kingdom of Judah? Can we be Jews in Babylon? And several prophets arise at this time. Without the temple, the synagogue became the center of Jewish life in exile, the synagogue being a gathering place, but over time becoming specifically a religious gathering place, rather like what we Christians would identify as a community church, a local congregation. And without the priests and the Levites around, though the Zatakites, the family of the high priest, they got some rather cushy positions with the Babylonians in the next empire. And nevertheless, for most people, there were no priests, there was no temple anymore, so we have the rise of the rabbis. And rabbis are educated, learned, religious men of any background. You didn't have to be a Levite or a priest. And they would, of course, lead the readings and interpret and preach from the scrolls of the sacred book of the law. So we have a transformation in Jewish life. It's becoming more local. It's becoming something that can survive in an alien land. Okie dokie. Now then, the prophets of the exile that I want to tackle, I'm going to hit the big ones, right? The major prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Those are the big guys. Then there's also about a dozen minor prophets, minor not because they were unimportant, but because they had smaller books. So let us start off by turning to the prophet Isaiah, and we're going to look at chapter 52, starting at the 13th verse, through chapter 53, ending at the 12th verse, okay? Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12. And what we read here is a prophecy of the suffering servant, an innocent man sent by God who is abused and broken and ultimately killed unjustly, in order somehow to redeem the guilty. This innocent person suffers and dies. And this prophecy of the suffering servant was in many ways quite confounding. Folks from the time thought that perhaps it referred to the nation of Israel as a whole, right? Here Israel is in exile, Israel is suffering, Israel is meant to be a blessing for all the peoples of the earth, and so perhaps the suffering servant stands in for the entire nation. Of course, the rest of the biblical corpus, including the rest of the book of Isaiah, would indicate that folks didn't go into exile because their hands were clean, right? This was justice. This was punishment from God meant to redeem his people, not God giving up on Judah, on the Israelite people, but the exile being sort of a just reward for wicked deeds, because the Israelites, our forebears in the faith, are human, like we are. They're not gods, they're not monsters, they're not perfect, they're not reprobate, they're people. And people screw up. Regardless, this is important for Christians because the prophecy of the suffering servant in these latter chapters of the book of Isaiah sounds an awful lot like Jesus Christ, who has not been born of Mary at the time of Isaiah's writing, at the time of exile, which is about 500 years before Jesus. But this notion of an innocent, divine man, person, suffering king who doesn't deserve what he gets, but in that way brings mercy to the undeserving. Well, that seed that gets planted comes to fruition in Christian theology, Christian understanding, with the revelation of Jesus Christ, and of course especially his passion, death, and resurrection, which we will be celebrating soon with Easter upcoming. Okay, let's hop over to the book of Jeremiah, another prophet of exile. Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 to 34. We read together that God, through Jeremiah, is prophesying a new covenant, one that will not be like the old, one in which the law of God will be written on the people's hearts, one in which all shall know God face to face. And this prophecy of a new covenant is where we get the terminology we use in the Christian Bible for the Old Testament and the New Testament. Why do we call it the New Testament, the New Covenant? Well, because of the prophecy in the Old Testament, the Old Covenant. Though these days it's considered more appropriate to refer to the Old Testament as the First Testament, right? Because it's not obsolete, obviously, otherwise we wouldn't be studying it. And of course it's not obsolete for our Jewish brothers and sisters. So there is a suffering servant coming, the prophets say. There is a new covenant coming, the prophets say. Let us turn now to the third prophet of exile, Ezekiel. Right in the beginning, chapter 1, verses 1 through 28, Ezekiel gives us a wild vision of heaven with God on his throne, a living throne. He is surrounded by angels who have an incredible appearance. There's angels with 4 heads, 3 of which are animals, 1 of which is human. There's angels who are a seraphim, that is burning ones, flaming serpents, flying around the throne of God. There are angels that are wheels within wheels covered in eyeballs. You know, it's a heck of a way to start a book. I've heard skeptics say that poor Ezekiel had schizophrenia. No, he didn't. No schizophrenic. so clearly and calmly describes his visions, which are just loaded with symbolism, prophecy about prophecy, as it were. But the main takeaway that I want us to get from Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 28, is that when the people of God are going into exile, into Babylon, having been conquered, Ezekiel sees the throne of God and heaven itself coming along with them. Remember, these are people who've lost everything they know about religion. They've lost the land, the temple, the kingship, the promise. Where is God when his people are in exile? He has gone into exile with him. The throne of God, the throne of heaven, is mobile. And no matter how wild or crazy the visions of awe seem to us when we first read them, the whole point of it is the wonder of the divine presence, the wonder of heaven, of Yahweh. He is going with his people into exile. He has not abandoned them. He has not given up on them. He is right there with them in what they're going through. Then let's hop to later in Ezekiel, shall we? Chapter 37, verses 1 through 14. Ezekiel 37, 1 to 14. And this is the famous Valley of Dry Bones. So, you should read it for yourself. You certainly will in your Faith 5 readings for the next fortnight. But you may know the story. Ezekiel is taken in a vision to a valley just full of dried bones. And God tells him to prophesy to the bones. And he does, and the bones come back together. And then flesh and sinew come upon them, and skin. And then Ezekiel prophesies to the wind, to the spirit, to come and fill these bodies and bring them back to life. And they do. And the dry bones are raised up as living men and women again. And God says, this is the whole house of Israel. I am resurrecting them. I am bringing them back to life, pulling them up from the valley of death. And on the one hand, of course, this can be taken very metaphorically. God is, through Ezekiel, prophesying the end of the exile, the return of the people, the rebirth of the nation. But clearly, this was also understood on a sort of more universal level, even a more literal level, because we begin to see now in the exile belief in a universal resurrection, which is to say, the land of the dead, the afterlife, has been spoken of in the Bible before this, but in fairly nebulous and general terms. The afterlife that the Hebrews speak of isn't all that different from what we see amongst the Mesopotamians and the Greeks and what have you. Heaven is a special place where the dead don't go unless you're a really special dead person like Moses or Enoch or Elijah, right? But now there's this emerging Jewish understanding that someday God will undo death itself, and all the dead shall be raised to judgment. All the dead shall be raised not simply to resuscitation, not simply to keep on doing what we were doing before. If this world were all there were and we had to do this forever, honestly, that would be a type of hell in and of itself. No. Resurrection is an entirely new kind of life, an undying life in which God is known face to face, one-on-one, written on our hearts, and we never need to fear death again. And we can see this belief most viscerally in the prophets of exile in writings like the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37. Okay, on to our fourth prophet of exile, Daniel. Very interesting book. It claims to have been written much earlier than we have the current form of the book, right? It appears to have been edited at a much later date, and yet it contains within it prophecies that probably are about as ancient as they claim to be. Granted, there's a lot there, so let's hit two that are probably the most important. Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 47, give us Daniel interpreting a dream of the king of Babylon. And he's very much like Joseph. You may remember Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Israel we talked about earlier, his whole thing was that God let him interpret dreams accurately. And Daniel is also someone who interprets dreams for a foreign king, not Pharaoh in Egypt, as it was for Joseph, but now the king of Babylon. There are many different takes, many different dreams. The one that we're focusing on here is the king dreams of a great statue, right? And the statue has 4 parts made of 4 different materials, different kinds of metal, and then feet of clay. And eventually a rock, not hewn with hands, a rock from the heavens comes and hits the clay feet of this mighty dream statue. And the feet shatter, of course, because clay is not very strong, and down goes the whole thing, all 4 parts. And for our purposes, what's important is that Daniel says this represents 4 great empires. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persian Empire, the empire of the Persians and the Medes, which is coming up next, and the Greeks. And then there is another empire that will be toppled by a stone from heaven, a rock from heaven, and that final empire will be given over to the saints of God. Okay? So several empires are expected until finally there's an empire that in conquering God's people is itself conquered by God's people. Keep that in mind. Because, of course, centuries later, Jesus will refer to Simon, his apostle, as Petrus, or Peter, the rock. And he sends the rock to Rome, the very empire that crucified Christ. And Rome, of course, famously is converted to Christianity. So for Christians, this prophecy of several empires until there's a last empire toppled by a rock that will hand the empire over to the saints. The rock, of course, is Christ and St. Peter, who convert the Roman Empire to Christianity, and from Rome, Christianity spreads throughout the world. All right. Also, let's hop over to Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14. 7, 9 through 14. And here we have a remarkable vision, especially for a monotheistic Jewish audience, of God as sort of an old man on a throne, which is not the standard image for God in the Hebrew Bible. And there is a younger God, or a younger version of God, who is given the authority of God in heaven. And this character, this person in Daniel's vision, is said to be like unto a son of man, which means he looks human, even though we know his origin is divine. And so from this point on, the Jewish people in exile and in return will be looking for a Messiah, one who is anointed by God, but not like the previous Messiah. Just anointed, I mean, kings were anointed, priests were anointed, prophets could be anointed. But there's a Messiah coming who won't be like the others. One who will look like a son of man, but who will in fact be so much more. And some think maybe he's an angel, maybe he's some sort of great wonder worker descended from heaven. Some even think he might be God himself on earth in the flesh. And this stems from Daniel and the other prophets of the exile. So keep in mind here, new visions or new understandings of old visions include the exile will end, the people will return, a Messiah is coming who will be like a son of man but be so much more underneath, and there will be a universal resurrection of the dead. We haven't heard these stories before in the Bible, but they arise from the experience of the exile and the fact that God is still with his people in the exile and the return. And that's our second lesson for today, the return from exile. Remember ABC. The Syrians took the north, Babylonians took the south, and C is for Cyrus the Great, first emperor of the Medes and Persians, who conquers Babylon and lets the people go home, lets the exiles return to rebuild their institutions, rebuild their temple, rebuild their structures of authority, their kings, of course, under Persian guidance, because Persia is a kinder, gentler empire, but it is still an empire. On a side note, I always kind of like to tell this story because I think it's fascinating. Cyrus the Great is an amazing character in history. Next to Alexander the Great, he's probably the person who most earned that sobriquet, the Great. Eventually, Cyrus the Great meets his end when he comes up against the Scythians, a warrior people in what would today be like the Black Sea area, Ukraine, that sort of thing. They were famous for being astounding horse archers, and they used envenomed arrows with little fangs that would break off when they hit. Nasty, nasty stuff. Alexander the Great, by the way, avoided the Scythians. The guy who conquered the whole world didn't want to go after them. Well, Cyrus, he's fighting the Scythians, and at one point, he gets a little tricksy, right? He fakes a retreat. And he even allows the Scythians to grab his baggage, his royal supply lines. And amongst the supplies, of course, are barrels of wine, which the Scythians immediately guzzle down in victory because they've defeated the great Persian Empire. However, this was all part of the plan. Cyrus poisoned the wine, and all kinds of Scythians die terribly from it. Well, this doesn't go over so well with the Scythian queen Tomyris. And basically, they ride out, the Scythians surround the Persians, they feather them with poisoned arrows until everybody's dead. Then Tomyris comes out, finds Cyrus the Great's body, cuts off his head, takes it to a big basin full of wine or blood, depending on which version you read, and drowns his head in the wine, saying, "You like to drink, do you?" There's a wonderful painting of this in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. After Cyrus's death, there's a bit of crisis in who takes over, a succession crisis. Bardia, who would have been the rightful heir, is killed, probably by his relative Cambyses. There's a famous legend about Cambyses, how he marched 50,000 people out into the Egyptian desert to fight a magician, and a great sandstorm came up, and all 50,000 were lost, never to be found again. It's called the Lost Army of Cambyses. Anyway, there's this big mess. A guy pops up pretending to be Bardia, scares the heck out of Cambyses because he thinks his brother's back from the dead after he murdered him. And when all the dust settles, the ruler of the Persian Empire is a guy named Darius, or Darius, who had been, as I recall, a spear bearer for the royal family. And how accurate the story of Darius' innocent rise to power is open to interpretation because, of course, he wrote the story. So anyway, Darius or Darius is the next emperor after Cyrus. Let's read from the book of Haggai, chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. We encounter a trio of men, Zerubbabel, Jeshua, and Haggai. And you may recall, the kingdom of Israel basically had a three-part power structure. There was the king, the high priest, and the prophet. Well, Zerubbabel, despite having a Babylonian name, is in fact descended from the legitimate kings of Judah. And he is assigned as the governor of Israel, of Judah, now that the people are able to go back. So he's the governor. He represents the kingship. Jeshua, or Joshua, or even Yeshua, he's the high priest. And Haggai is the prophet. And so they're sort of reconstituting the southern kingdom of Judah. So in Haggai chapter 1, Haggai and Zechariah pushed to have the temple rebuilt right away. But it was hard to convince many of the peoples in exile to return. The exile was 70 years long. And a lot of the Judean people started new lives. They like where they're at. They have new communities. They have new businesses, new homes, all throughout what today we would call Iraq and Iran. And they don't necessarily want to go back to the old kingdom that got its butt kicked 70 years ago. So it takes a lot of wheedling and cajoling and tempting to get people to come back and rebuild Judah. And even the people who do come back, they're more concerned with, building houses and whatnot than they are with immediately restoring the temple to its former glory. Returnees got to eat before they can pray, I suppose. Now, as there were waves of exile, people weren't all taken away at the same time. So there are waves of return. Some people come back, there's a pause. Some more people come back, there's a pause. And it goes on like this for some time. The Zatakites, that is, those folks descended supposedly from the high priestly family of Zadok, who was the high priest under King David, they still hold favor and therefore power with their Persian overlords. The Zatakites will become the functionaries, the go-to guys, and eventually they sort of evolve into what we will know of in the New Testament as Sadducees, those opponents and interlocutors of Jesus, right? Okay, let's continue with Haggai chapter 2, verses 20 through 23, and we have here prophecies of the Messiah and a bit of apocalypse. Now, a couple centuries ago, when the southern kingdom was conquered, one of the prophets wrote about how Jehoiakim was like a signet ring that God took off and cast away because of his wickedness, his sin, his evil. You can't be an evil ruler and still claim to represent God. Well, here we have the prophecy of God basically giving the signet ring back to Zerubbabel, restoring the kingship, restoring the Davidic line. And Zerubbabel is spoken of as if he might be this hoped for Messiah, this cosmic king who will be better than all the others. And what's important here to note is what exactly an apocalypse is. An apocalypse is not a story about the end of the world. An apocalypse is a specific sort of story, a genre that arises amidst crisis. And what an apocalypse does is it takes current events, worldly events, and interprets them through a heavenly lens, right? It's like watching terrible things on the news and people going, where is God in all of this? And somebody saying, here's where God is in all the things that are going on. That's an apocalypse. Earthly crises interpreted through a heaven-centered understanding. The whole book of Revelation in the Bible, the biggest apocalypse we've got, is really about Romans destroying Jerusalem and trying to figure out where God is when Jerusalem is burning. The other thing about apocalypse is, like I said, it's not about the end of the world. An apocalypse specifically says there's going to be an end of the world. Not in the sense of termination, it's all over, but in the sense of fulfillment and purpose. Good will win out, evil will peter out. And an apocalypse tells us there is an end to the world, it's a good end, and this isn't it. The bad things happening now are not the end of the world. The end will come much later, and the end will be much better. So an apocalypse is to comfort and reassure and strengthen people in terrible crisis. All right, and then check out Zechariah chapter 6, verses 9 through 15, and we hear about a branch arising from the stump of Jesse. Jesse, remember, being King David's father. Zerubbabel himself does not fulfill messianic expectations, but the prophets are still saying, the Messiah is coming, the cosmic king is coming, the one like unto a son of man is coming to set all things right, to reestablish the kingdom of God on earth in a way that Zerubbabel and Jeshua and Haggai can't do under the Persian Empire. And so now they're still looking for the Messiah. They're looking, by the way, on a timeline laid out in the book of Daniel Daniel basically said he's coming in 490 years. And this starts a countdown that people pay close attention to. Surprise, surprise, the countdown runs out right around the time Jesus shows up, which is why messianic expectations are so high at the beginning of the New Testament. And of course, Jesus is from Nazareth, and the root of Nazareth or Nazarene means branch. They are people who claim descent from David. They've lost all the trappings of royalty and wealth. In fact, evidence is that the people of Nazareth had been horse warriors for the Persian Empire. Nevertheless, their name means branch, and it refers to this prophecy that a branch will arise from the stump of Jesse. A king from the line of kings will return. That's where Return of the King got it. And in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, we can see this fulfillment. Jesus is the descendant of Zerubbabel. He is the branch from Nazareth. He is in the proper Davidic line of kings. He is the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ, the suffering servant of Isaiah, the bringer of Jeremiah's new covenant, the resurrector of Ezekiel, and of course the one who will be murdered by Rome, only then to conquer Rome, as prophesied in Daniel. It all for us goes back to Jesus. Everything, including the exile and the return. All right. I've gone a little over half an hour. 30 minutes was my goal. So I look forward to seeing you in church or in confirmation or right back here virtually in 2 weeks. In the meantime, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord look upon you all with favor and grant you peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.